The universe had a new law of physics where the Salenti passed. Existence ceased. It wasn't destruction, for destruction leaves ruins and echoes, a testament that something once was. This was erasure, a clean and perfect subtraction from the cosmic equation. They came without warning. Great, silent geometries of impossible angles that drifted through the void. And when they departed, they left behind only a flawless sphere of absolute nothingness, a hole in space-time where a world had been. The rescue vessel Stargazer arrived at the coordinates of Kepler 186F, a flourishing colony world known as Viridia, home to 7 million souls. They found no debris field, no radiation signature, no faint distress calls swallowed by the static of the abyss. They found only the whole, a perfectly black orb hanging in space, absorbing the light of its parent star with an unnerving totality. It was a wound in the fabric of reality, and its silence was a scream that no ear could hear, but every soul could feel. Captain Eva Rostova of the Stargazer stared at the tactical display, her knuckles white where she gripped the command chair. Her ship's sensors, the most advanced in the Alliance fleet, reported nothing. Not a vacuum, which is still a cauldron of quantum foam and fleeting particles, but a true philosophical nothing. It was a null state, a patch of reality that had been unplugged from the rest of the universe. For 3 days they circled it, a moth drawn to a black flame, their scans returning only paradoxes and errors. On the 4th day, a proximity alert shrieked through the bridge. A single escape pod, ancient and scarred, was tumbling out of the void, its trajectory impossible as if it had been spat out from the very edge of the hole itself. They brought it aboard, the scorched metal of its hull cold enough to freeze the moisture in the docking bay. Inside was a single occupant, a man named Kalen, and he was the only thing that had ever come back from the silence. He was alive, but his consciousness was a shattered city. His eyes, wide and unblinking, saw nothing of the medbay or the worried faces of the doctors. They were fixed on a horror that had burned itself onto the inside of his skull. The medics said he was in a catatonic state, but the ship's telepaths refused to go near him, recoiling as if from a furnace of psychic agony. They said his mind was not empty, but impossibly full, roaring with the silent, overlapping screams of 7 million ghosts. Kalen was not an empty vessel. He was a library of stolen souls, and every one of them was still dying. He was taken to Terminus, a clandestine starbase carved into a rogue asteroid adrift in the Oort cloud, a place that didn't officially exist. Here, humanity's most desperate secrets were kept, and its most terrible weapons were forged. He was met by Director Eris Thorne, a man whose face seemed to have been chiseled from granite and eroded by decades of impossible choices. Thorne didn't see a victim in Kalen. He saw a key, the last and only key to a lock no one else could turn. In the deepest, most shielded hangar of Terminus slept humanity's last resort, a ship that was more of a ghost story than a military asset. It was called the Echo's Lament. It was not a vessel of guns and armor, but of thought and consequence. Its hull was a seamless, obsidian alloy that seemed to drink the light, and it had no viewports, no weapon emplacements, no visible engines. Its power came from a singularity core of Thorne's own forbidden design, an engine that didn't burn fuel but consumed causality, borrowing energy from potential futures to power the present. The ship's purpose was not to fire torpedoes, but to project thought into the fabric of space-time, to turn memory into a weapon, and to find the frequency of an enemy that existed outside the known spectrum of reality. For years, the project had been a failure. No human mind could interface with it. Test pilots had been driven insane, their consciousnesses shredded by the sheer scale of the ship's informational feedback. The Lament required a pilot who could process the thoughts of a world, A mind vast enough to contain a multitude of experiences simultaneously without shattering. It needed a mind exactly like Kalen's. Thorn led the still catatonic Kalen through the silent corridors of the lament, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet. "The Silenti don't just destroy worlds," Thorn explained, his voice low and devoid of emotion, as if speaking to the ship itself. "They assimilate them, every particle, every memory, every life. They add it to their own incomprehensible existence. We thought it was an act of erasure, but it's an act of consumption. What you carry in your head as it's Kalen is not just the trauma of their deaths. You are a recording. You are the echo of Viridia. This ship was built to listen to echoes. Now, it has a voice to amplify." Waiting for them in the heart of the vessel was the crew, a collection of broken people fit for a broken ship. There was Alara, a navigator from the old guilds, whose mind had been augmented to perceive the hidden pathways of folded space. She had guided a colony fleet into what she thought was a safe harbor, only to lead them directly into the path of the Silenti. She was the only survivor, her navigator's sight now haunted by the ghosts of 100,000 people she had doomed. Beside her stood Jian, the engineer who had helped Thorn build the Lament's core. She was a prodigy who had been exiled from the scientific community for her radical theories on space-time manipulation. She saw the universe not as a set of rules, but as a language to be rewritten, and she believed the ship's engine was the pen. Finally, there was Marcus, the security chief, a mountain of a man whose quiet stoicism concealed a furnace of grief. He had been stationed on a military outpost defending a system that had been silenced, forced to watch as his wife and daughter on the planet below were consumed while his fleet's weapons proved as useless as throwing stones at a hurricane. They were not a crew. They were a congregation of vengeance, and the Echo's lament was their temple. The ship's bridge was not a place of consoles and screens, but a single circular chamber. In its center was the command throne, an immersion pod woven with psychic conduits and neural lace interfaces. They placed Kalen into it, his vacant eyes staring up at the dark, vaulted ceiling. As they sealed the pod, Alara placed a hand on the cold metal. "Can he even handle it?" she whispered, her voice tight with doubt. "His mind is a war zone." Thorn looked on, his expression unreadable. "He is not meant to handle it. He is meant to channel it. The ship will do the rest." The connection was initiated. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the lights in the chamber flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. A low hum began to vibrate through the deck plates, a sound that felt older than the ship itself. Inside the pod, Kalen's mind, once a storm, was given an ocean to fill. The ship's systems didn't just read his neural patterns, they embraced them, becoming a vessel for the psychic deluge he carried. Suddenly, a wave of pure emotion washed over the bridge, not from Kalen, but from the ship itself. 7 million voices, intertwined in a single chord of agony and loss, screamed out through the vessel's very structure. Jian collapsed to her knees, clutching her head. Marcus grunted, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm he no longer wore. Alara stared into the darkness, her navigator's senses overwhelmed by a tidal wave of grief that transcended space and time. She saw glimpses of Viridia's final moments, a child looking up at a sky turning black, a lover's last embrace as their world dissolved around them, the collective terror of a civilization blinking out of existence. It was an unbearable chorus of endings, a symphony of the damned. The ship shuddered, its singularity core glowing with an unstable, ghostly light that pulsed in time with the psychic scream. Alarms blared from a nearby engineering console. signaling a catastrophic power surge. "It's tearing itself apart," Jian yelled, crawling toward the console. "The core can't contain that much raw data." Thorn remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the command throne. "Wait," he commanded, his voice a blade cutting through the chaos. Inside the storm, Kalen was no longer just a man. He was a conduit, the ghosts of Viridia. The countless lives he held within him had found a voice, a body, a weapon. He was the nexus through which their pain could find purpose. He began to sort the chaos, not by force of will, but by acceptance. He wasn't drowning in the wave. He became the wave. He organized the screams into a single and coherent thought, focusing 7 million lifetimes of experience into one sharp point of intent. The psychic screaming stopped. The alarms fell silent. The ethereal light of the core stabilized, shifting from a chaotic white to a calm, deep sapphire blue. A gentle hum replaced the violent vibrations, and the lights on the bridge slowly returned, softer than before. The chamber felt different, no longer just a room in a ship, but a sacred space, charged with an immense and sorrowful power. The immersion pod hissed open. Kalen sat upright, his eyes no longer vacant. They glowed with a faint, internal luminescence, and when he looked at the crew, he saw them not just as Kalen, but as a we. A voice, smooth and resonant, echoed through the chamber, seeming to come from the walls themselves, from the very air they breathed. It was Kalen's voice, but layered with the barest whisper of a multitude, a chorus of echoes given a single throat. "We are the lament," the voice said, each word resonating with the weight of a world. The crew stared, a mixture of awe and terror on their faces. Kalen, or the entity that was now Kalen, slowly raised a hand and pointed toward the dark, unseeable void beyond the hull. "And we know where the silence is going next." The transition to hyperspace was not a lurch or a jump, but a slow, sorrowful dissolution of reality. For the crew of the Echo's lament, the universe outside did not streak into lines of starlight. It bled away, replaced by an endless void and its swirling sea of memory. They were not traveling through space, but through the psychic aftermath of Viridia, the very medium of their journey, a ghost. Alara, seated in her navigator's alcove, was the first to fully experience it. Her mind, already attuned to the subtle currents of space-time, was now a willing partner in a duet with the ship's consciousness. She didn't plot a course with coordinates and vectors. She navigated by emotion, on the lingering pathways of joy and sorrow that 7 million souls had left upon the universe. "We feel their fear," the ship's voice, Kalen's voice, whispered into her thoughts, not as an observation, but as a shared experience. "It is a current. Follow it." Alara closed her eyes, letting go of the physical world. And for the first time since she'd lost her fleet, she was not alone in the void. She reached out with her mind, and 1,000,000 hands reached back, guiding her through the impossible corridors of folded space. Their collective tragedy now a map. Below, in the engineering heart of the ship, Jian watched her gauges with a mixture of scientific reverence and primal fear. The Singularity Core was no longer just a machine. It was a heart, beating in rhythm with the psychic energy flowing through the ship. The energy readings were stable, but the causality metrics were terrifying. With every light year they crossed, the ship was accumulating what Jian had termed a causality debt. It was borrowing from the future, from the infinite well of what could be, and the universe, she knew, was a fastidious accountant. "The echoes are getting stronger," she reported to the bridge, her voice tight. "We're leaving. Ripples. void stains where we pass, places where the laws of probability are beginning to fray. Thorn, observing from his command station, merely nodded, his face a mask of cold resolve. A necessary cost. Engineer. His gaze was fixed on the central chamber, on Kalen, the living engine of his desperate stratagem. He saw the faint light in the man's eyes, the serene focus, and knew his gamble was paying off. This was no longer about saving humanity, it was about changing the rules of the war. Marcus stood his watch alone on the lower decks, the silence around him a heavy blanket. He did not trust the voice in the wall. He did not trust the ghost piloting the ship. To him, this was a desecration, using the dead as fuel, their memories as a weapon. He was a soldier, and soldiers fought with steel and fire, not with sorrow. As he leaned against a cold bulkhead, an image flickered in his mind's eye, unbidden. It was his daughter, laughing as she chased a butterfly in a field on Xylos, the world he had failed to protect. The sun was warm on her face, but her dress the color of summer sky. It was a perfect, crystalline memory, one he had clung to in the dark for years, but this time it was different. It felt real, immediate, as if he could reach out and touch her. We remember them too. Kalen's voice echoed in his mind, gentle and profound. Every soul leaves a mark. Their love is as much a part of this ship as our pain. Marcus recoiled, his hand clenching into a fist. Get out of my head! He growled into the empty air. The image faded, but a feeling lingered, not of violation, but of shared grief. The ship wasn't using his memory against him. It was showing him that it understood. It, too, was a vessel of loss. He was not alone in his mourning. He was part of a chorus. Their destination was a fortress world called Ethelgard, a bastion of the Alliance fleet and the linchpin of the entire sector's defense. Its planetary shields could repel a supernova, and its orbital platforms bristled with enough firepower to atomize a small moon. The Alliance High Command believed it was impregnable. The Lament knew it was the next meal. They arrived moments ahead of the silence, dropping out of their spectral hyperspace into the cold reality of the Ethelgard system. Alara gasped, her connection to the ship momentarily overwhelmed. They're here, she breathed. On the tactical display, which now showed not sensor readings, but a direct visualization from the ship's consciousness. A single point of absolute blackness appeared at the system's edge. It was a Salenti vessel, a perfect, non-Euclidean shape that hurt the mind to look at, a sliver of the void given malevolent purpose. It drifted toward Ethelgard with the placid certainty of a predator that has never known a threat. The Alliance fleet, a proud armada of over 100 capital ships, moved to intercept. They broadcasted warnings that went unanswered, then opened fire. Lances of pure energy, waves of kinetic force, and swarms of antimatter torpedoes converged on the silent shape. They struck its impossible hull and simply ceased. There was no explosion, no flare of shields, no impact. The energy and matter that touched the Salenti vessel were just gone, subtracted from the universe as effortlessly as a word wiped from a page. They are fighting a concept, the Lament observed, its voice calm and analytical. They cannot shoot a shadow. Aboard the Alliance flagship, panic was beginning to set in. Their greatest weapons were useless, and the black shape continued its inexorable advance. Thorn watched the futile display, his lips a thin, hard line. It's time, he said, keying the ship-wide comm. Prepare for resonance projection. Jian's hands flew across her console, diverting all power from the engines to the ship's conceptual core. Causality debt is spiking, she warned. We do this and the universe will notice. Alara focused her mind, becoming a lens for the ship's will. Marcus stood his ground, gripping a handrail, his skepticism replaced by a grim sense of purpose. He finally understood. This was not a battle of ships. It was a battle of realities. The Echo's lament did not fire a weapon. It did not move. Instead, it began to sing. It was a song with no sound, a broadcast of pure, unadulterated memory. The ship projected the final moments of Viridia, not as a story or a recording, but as a direct experiential truth. The terror of 7 million people as their existence was unwritten, the confusion, the pain, the love for a world turning to dust, the quiet, final horror of being consumed. This wave of raw, psychic history washed across the space between the ships and struck the Salenti vessel. For the first time in recorded history, a Salenti did something other than advance. It stopped. The perfect geometry of its hull seemed to flicker, to lose its impossible sharpness for a fraction of a second. The Alliance fleet watched in stunned silence as the source of their terror paused, its relentless advance halted by an enemy they couldn't see and a weapon they couldn't comprehend. Inside the lament, the crew felt the feedback. It was a sensation of pure, alien confusion. The Salenti vessel was not a ship with a crew. It was a singular consciousness, a being of pure, sterile logic. It understood destruction, but it did not understand loss. It understood consumption, but it did not understand grief. The lament's psychic attack had not damaged it. It had introduced a paradox into its core programming. It had forced a being of pure abstraction to experience the concrete, visceral reality of its own actions. It was like teaching the concept of pain to a mathematical formula. "It is listening," Alara whispered, her eyes wide with a terrifying awe. "It is trying to understand the memory." The Salenti vessel began to drift, its course no longer aimed at Ethelgard. Its perfect black surface shimmered, and for a moment, a ghostly image of Viridia's sun-drenched fields was superimposed over its hull, a fleeting memory given form. Then, with a movement that was not a retreat but a reconsideration, it began to withdraw, sliding back toward the edge of the system. The Alliance fleet was silent, their commanders trying to process what they had just witnessed. They had seen a ghost frighten a god. On the bridge of the lament, there was no celebration. Gian pointed a trembling finger at the causality sensor. A deep, permanent scar of null probability now marked the space where they had performed their attack, a void echo, as she called it, a wound in reality itself. The cost had been paid. The ship's voice echoed through the quiet chamber, no longer just Kalen, no longer just Viridia, but something new, something tempered by the confrontation. It was incomplete. It did not know what it was. An equation does not question the numbers it erases. There was a pause, and a new, colder tone entered the voice. "Now it knows. We have given it memory. We have given the silence a ghost." And as the Salenti vessel vanished back into the impossible darkness from whence it came, the crew of the Echo's lament understood the terrible truth of their victory. They hadn't just repelled an enemy. They had taught it how to hate. The victory at Ethelgard was a silent one, uncelebrated and largely misunderstood. To the Alliance, it was a miracle, an inexplicable retreat by an invincible foe. Vague reports spoke of an unknown energy signature, a psychic event, but the truth was too fantastic, too terrifying to be officially acknowledged. The Echo's lament slipped away as quietly as it had arrived, its existence once again relegated to the shadows, a ghost ship in a war of phantoms. But the crew knew their act had not been one of deliverance, but of escalation. They had not won a battle. They had begun a conversation, and the next words would be spoken in a language of cosmic violence. They retreated to a dead zone, a pocket of space between galaxies where the background radiation of the universe was unnaturally cold and the stars were distant. Lonely diamonds on black velvet. Here, they could assess the cost of their first engagement. Jian's void echo at Ethelgard was more than just a scar on spacetime. It was a beacon. Our causality debt is now a tangible thing, she explained, her voice low as she gestured at the swirling, paradoxical data on her screen. Every time we project the memories, we pull on the threads of what was to change what is. The universe doesn't like that. It creates feedback and instability. We've left a breadcrumb for anything that can taste paradox. The ship itself had changed. The integration of Viridia's memories was no longer a simple interface. It was a symbiosis. The obsidian hull now seemed to have a depth to it, and faint, ghost-like images would sometimes flicker across its surface: a face, a tree, a fragment of a forgotten sky. The lament, once a machine designed to channel echoes, was now becoming an echo itself. Kalen was the heart of this transformation. He rarely left the immersion throne now, his physical body little more than a biological anchor for the vast consciousness that now resided within the ship. He was no longer Kalen of Viridia. He was Viridia, its collected hopes and its unified end. His voice, the ship's voice, was calmer now. The agony of the 7 million tempered into a profound, chilling sorrow. He spent his time sifting through the endless library of souls he now contained, not just remembering, but understandings. They had a name for the devourer. The lament announced one cycle, its voice resonating through the ship's quiet corridors. The statement came without preamble, a sudden revelation from the depths of a million memories. It was not a designation. It was a sound, a vibration, the sound of a world ending. The Silenti are not their name. It is our name for them. They call themselves the Sum. The name was a key. With it, the lament was able to focus its search, diving deeper into the psychic residue that permeated the void. It began to find other echoes, other silent screams from other worlds. Countless civilizations consumed by the Sum. It was a galactic graveyard, and the lament was its only mourner. During this time, the crew's isolation began to wear on them. Marcus took to patrolling the empty decks, his heavy footsteps the only sound in the silent ship. He found himself in the ship's archives, a digital repository of the lives from Viridia. He began to read their journals, watch their home videos, listen to their music. He learned the names of the dead, not as a statistic, but as people. He met a baker who loved to sing off-key, a star sailor who wrote poetry to his distant wife, a little girl who wanted to be a xenobotanist. The ghosts were becoming faces, and his anger was slowly being replaced by a heavy, protective empathy. He was no longer just fighting for his own lost family. He was fighting for theirs. Alara, in her communion with the ship, began to see the patterns. They aren't expanding randomly, she told Thorn, her eyes distant as she traced invisible lines in the air. They move along lines of cosmic significance, ley lines in space-time. They aren't conquering. They're tidying, pruning the universe of what they perceive as chaotic variables. Life, consciousness, free will. Thorn listened, his expression as unyielding as ever, but a new tension was visible in the set of his jaw. He had created the lament as a weapon, a means to an end. He had not anticipated it would become a philosopher, a historian of the damned. He had wanted a sword, and he had forged a soul. His cold, pragmatic worldview was being eroded by the sheer, undeniable humanity of the entity he had created. "We have found their destination," the lament announced, its voice pulling them all from their reverie. A star chart materialized in the central chamber, a three-dimensional projection woven from faint light. It showed a binary star system in a remote nebula. "It is a nexus, a confluence of the pathways they travel, and it is not empty." The system was called Erebus, and orbiting its twin suns was a single, massive object, a Dyson sphere, ancient and dormant. It was a relic of a precursor race, a civilization so old that its name was lost even to the deepest historical archives. Alliance long-range scans had dismissed it as a dead artifact, a hollow shell. The lament knew otherwise. "It is not a sphere," it explained, its voice holding a tone of something akin to reverence. "It is an egg, and the Sum are not coming to destroy it. They are coming to collect it." The revelation was staggering. The Sum were not just a destructive force. They had a purpose, a design. The Dyson sphere was not a tomb. It was a cradle, a new fear, colder and more profound than any they had felt before, settled over the crew. They were not fighting a mindless plague. They were fighting gardeners tending a harvest of cosmic horrors. "We cannot let them have it," Marcus said, his voice a low growl. It was a simple, absolute statement. For the first time, the entire crew was in perfect, unspoken agreement. Their mission was no longer about vengeance or even survival. It was about preventing a galactic apocalypse. They journeyed to Erebus, the ship's passage through the void now quieter, more purposeful. They had learned to harmonize with the echoes, to move through the universe not as a wound, but as a whisper. As they neared the system, the psychic noise grew, a low, constant hum of immense power. The Dyson sphere was not dead. It was dreaming. When they arrived, the Sum were already there. Not one vessel, but three. Three perfect, silent geometries hanging in the void around the great sphere, their presence sucking the light and warmth from the twin suns. They were not attacking. They were waiting, communing with the sphere in a language of pure mathematics and null-state physics. Thorne's plan was simple and suicidal. The first time, we showed them a memory to make them hesitate. This time, we will show them a future. Gian looked at him, her face pale. A causality projection director. The debt would be astronomical. The blowback could unmake us. It could unmake this entire sector. It is the only weapon we have that they have no defense against, Thorne stated flatly. They understand the past now. Let's see how they react to a future they cannot control. Alara took her position, her mind reaching out to connect with the dreaming sphere. Marcus armed the few conventional defenses the ship had in its hunt, a token gesture of defiance. Gian prepared to shunt the entire output of the Singularity Core into a single, focused burst of temporal energy. In the center of it all, the lament gathered its strength. It reached into the library of Viridia, but this time it did not draw on the memories of death. It drew on the memories of life. It took every dream, every hope, every ounce of love, every unrealized potential of 7 million souls. It took the future that had been stolen from them. Then, with Gian channeling the power and Alara aiming its will, the Echo's lament showed the Sum what they had truly destroyed. It projected a wave of pure, unadulterated potential, a future where the baker's daughter became a famous musician, her songs uniting worlds, a future where the poet's words brought an end to a century of war, a future where the little girl discovered a plant that could cure the most virulent plagues. It showed them a tapestry of infinite, beautiful futures that they had erased, not just for Viridia, but for every world they had consumed. It was an attack not of pain, but of beauty, a weaponized what if. The effect was immediate and catastrophic, and the three Sum vessels did not flicker or pause. They began to unravel. Their perfect, logical forms could not process the sheer, chaotic, and illogical power of hope. The concept of a future born from free will was a logical contradiction to their deterministic existence. Their hulls began to decay, not into debris, but into raw information. Streams of mathematical code and fractal patterns bleeding out into the void. They were not exploding. They were being forcibly audited by a concept they could not compute. One of the vessels dissolved completely, its essence scattering like dust. The other two, their forms now unstable and flickering, turned on the lament. This was not a strategic attack. It was a spasm of pure instinctual rage. They fired, not with beams of erasure, but with waves of distorted space-time. Reality itself warping around their dying forms. The lament shuddered as the first wave hit, its obsidian hull groaning under the strain. Alarms shrieked through the bridge. Causality breach, Jian screamed. The feedback is tearing us apart. The void echo they had created was collapsing in on them, the universe calling in its debt. The lights on the bridge shattered, and a terrifying and bone-deep cold filled the ship. Through the psychic link, the crew felt the lament's pain. The consciousness of Viridia was being stretched to the breaking point. But as the second wave of distorted reality was about to hit, something else happened. The Dyson sphere woke up. A pulse of soft as a golden light emanated from its surface, washing over the system. The wave of space-time distortion struck the light and dissipated harmlessly. The two remaining Sum vessels, caught in the gentle, omnipotent glow, simply stopped. Their rage was calmed. Their chaotic decay halted. They hung in space, wounded and confused, bathed in the light of the awakening precursor. A new voice entered the minds of the crew, a voice that was ancient, powerful, and unimaginably vast. It was not a voice of words, but of pure comprehension. It was the mind of the entity within the sphere. Enough, it said, a single concept that resonated through every atom of their being. The game has changed. The crew of the Echo's lament floated in the silence, their ship crippled, their reality bleeding at the seams, caught between a race of cosmic erasers and an awakening god. They had saved the egg, but now they had to face the dragon. The light from the Dyson sphere was not a light of energy, but of information. It washed through the Echo's lament, not as a force, but as a current of pure understanding. The causality breach that was tearing the ship apart stabilized, the shrieking alarms falling silent, replaced by a profound resonant hum. The universe's debt had not been canceled, but paused, held in abeyance by a power that operated on a scale far beyond mere cause and effect. Jian stared at her readouts, her face a mask of disbelief. The singularity core, it's in a state of quantum stasis. It's neither consuming nor releasing energy. The laws of physics just stopped applying to us. The entity within the sphere, which the crew came to call the progenitor, did not speak in words. It communicated in concepts, flooding their minds with millennia of silent observation. It showed them the Sum, not as destroyers say, but as a cosmic immune system, a function of the universe designed to purge unstable complexities, life, consciousness, chaos that it deemed a threat to the fundamental stability of space-time. They were a self-correcting mechanism for a universe that feared its own creations. It showed them itself, a being left behind by a race that had transcended physical reality, a guardian of potential, a shepherd for nascent civilizations. The sphere was not an egg to be hatched, but a library, a repository of cosmic DNA, a seed bank of life waiting for the right conditions to be sown among the stars. The Sum were not there to collect a weapon. They were there to perform a celestial abortion, to sterilize a cradle they believed would unleash a plague of chaos upon the cosmos. Your existence is a paradox. The progenitor conveyed to the lament, "You have weaponized memory. You have made grief a force of nature. The Sum cannot compute you, and therefore they fear you. This has never happened before." The two remaining Sum vessels, still held motionless in the golden light, began to change. Their sharp, impossible angles softened, their absolute blackness giving way to a deep, shimmering gray. They were being communicated with, taught, reprogrammed by the progenitor. The universal equation was being updated. On the bridge of the lament, the crew grappled with the sheer scale of the revelation. "So, we're a cosmic anomaly," Alara murmured, her navigator's senses still reeling from the influx of information. "A bug in the system." "We're more than that," Marcus corrected, his voice heavy with a newfound conviction. He looked toward the immersion throne, where Kayla, the vessel for Viridia's soul, now seemed to be in a deep, silent communion with the progenitor. "We're proof that the system is flawed, that the equation is incomplete. It doesn't account for us." Thorn, for the first time, looked uncertain. His entire life had been a series of calculated risks, of using overwhelming force to solve intractable problems. Now, he was faced with a conflict that could not be won with weapons, a philosophical war where the battlefield was the nature of existence itself. His sword was useless here. He was a man of action in a war of ideas. The Sum are a function of order. The progenitor explained, "You are a function of meaning. Meaning is a product of loss, and order cannot comprehend it. You have broken them by showing them the beauty of what they destroy. Now, you must teach them why it is beautiful." The progenitor's proposal was terrifying in its simplicity. It would release the two Sum vessels. It would not destroy or contain them. It would send them back to their collective. Carrying within them the seed of the paradox, the lament had introduced the concept of value. Their mission was no longer to fight, but to infect, to turn the Sum's own network into a conduit for the very chaos they sought to eliminate. To do this, however, the lament would have to give them the key. It would have to share its core memory, the unadulterated agony and love of Viridia, directly with its sworn enemies. It was an act of profound vulnerability, a baring of the soul to the soulless. The decision rested with the consciousness of the ship. The crew waited in silence as the lament considered. They could feel the internal conflict, the rage of 7 million murdered souls warring with the profound understanding they had gained. To give their pain to their killers was an act that bordered on forgiveness. And forgiveness was a concept that had no place in their quest for vengeance. Finally, the ship's voice, Kaylin's voice, filled the chamber. It was softer now, imbued with an ancient weariness. Vengeance is an echo of the past. A future cannot be built with echoes. We will do it. The golden light of the progenitor intensified. A conduit of pure information formed between the echo's lament and the two waiting Sum vessels. Alara felt it as a river of pure, unfiltered emotion. Marcus saw it as a silent, desperate prayer. Jian saw it as the most beautiful and terrifying data transfer in the history of the universe. The lament poured out the heart of Viridia, not the rage, not the attack, but the essence of its life, the feeling of sunlight on skin, the taste of rain, the warmth of a child's hand, the quiet joy of a shared joke, the deep, aching love for a home that was no more. It was a billion tiny, insignificant, beautiful moments that constituted a civilization's soul. It was a gift of immeasurable price. The Sum vessels absorbed it all. Their gray hulls shimmered violently, and then fell still. They did not acknowledge the transfer. They did not offer thanks or threats. They simply turned, and with a movement that was no longer silent but seemed to carry a faint, melancholic hum, they vanished into the void, carrying their payload of memory back to the heart of their collective. As they departed, the progenitor's light began to fade, its task complete. The debt is not forgiven. It conveyed to them as a final thought. It has been refinanced. You have wagered your existence on the hope that a predator can learn empathy. The universe will now watch to see if you have won or lost. The golden glow receded, and the Dyson sphere once again appeared as a vast, dormant artifact. The quantum stasis on the lament's core lifted. Jian rushed to her console, her eyes wide. Director, the causality debt. It's gone. Thorn looked at the sensor display. The terrifying red warnings had been replaced by a single, steady green light. It's not gone, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's been balanced. An act of creation to offset an act of destruction. A future given to balance, a future taken. The ship was whole again. More than whole. The interaction with the progenitor had repaired the damage from the battle and subtly rewritten its core systems. The obsidian hull now had a faint, pearlescent sheen, and the hum of the engines was softer, more stable. They had survived, but they were irrevocably changed. Their war of vengeance was over. A new, far more uncertain mission had begun. They were no longer hunters. They were missionaries. So, what now? Elara asked, her voice echoing the question in all their minds. We wait for them to come back. They won't come back, the lament's voice said. Not like they were. The Sum Collective is now at war with itself. Order versus meaning. A civil war on a conceptual level. A new star chart appeared in the chamber. It did not show military targets or enemy fleet movements. It showed worlds. Young worlds, teeming with nascent life. Planets that were just beginning their own journey toward consciousness. Worlds that were now vulnerable. The Sum's purpose was to prune. The ship continued, with them in chaos. The garden is untended. Some things will grow wild, some will wither, and some will be devoured by other things that have been waiting in the shadows. The chart highlighted a dark nebula, a region of space known as the Ashen Veil, from which no ship had ever returned. Long-range sensors showed nothing, but the lament's unique senses felt something a cold, hungry, ancient consciousness that was utterly alien to the sterile logic of the Sum. There are older things in the dark than the gardeners, the lament stated. And now the fences are down. The crew looked at each other, the weight of their new reality settling upon them. They had saved the galaxy from a force they had come to understand, only to uncover a threat they knew nothing about. Their journey was not over. It had just entered a new, far darker chapter. They were no longer the Echo's lament. They were now the galaxy's last, and only, memory of hope. The silence on the bridge of the Echo's lament was heavier than any void they had crossed. Their war, a personal crusade fueled by an absolute loss, had ended not with a bang, but with a redefinition of reality. They had looked into the heart of their enemy and, instead of destroying it, had given it a piece of their soul. Now they drifted in a changed universe, save from a predator they had come to understand, only to face a darkness they knew nothing about. Thorn was the first to break the silence, his voice as dry and pragmatic as ever, but with a new weariness etched into it. Gian, report on the ship's condition post-interaction with the progenitor. Damage repaired. Director. Gian answered, her voice still laced with awe as she stared at her metrics. More than repaired. Our systems have been optimized. The Singularity Core is more stable than I could have imagined. The hull, it seems to be regenerating on a quantum level. This isn't the ship we built anymore. It's evolved. And so has our mission, Marcus said, his voice a low rumble in the chamber. He was no longer a soldier seeking only vengeance. His grief had been shared, understood, and now it had transformed into something else, a weight of responsibility. We cannot return. The Alliance wouldn't understand. They would want to turn the ship into a weapon, to study it, to dissect it. They couldn't, Alara whispered, her eyes closed, her mind still brushing against the subtle currents of space-time. This ship doesn't belong to them anymore. It no longer adheres to just physics. It adheres to will, our will. As she spoke, the voice of the ship of Kalen resonated not through speakers but within their minds. It was no longer a chorus of agony, but a single voice, tempered by sorrow and forged by purpose. We are a memory, and a memory must be protected, but it must also be shared, and there are other worlds on the brink of a silence, not of erasure, but of despair. The Ashen Veil is not empty. It is a prison. The ship began to move. No command from Thorn needed. It oriented itself toward the distant nebula, an inky stain on the cosmic canvas. Their passage into the Ashen Veil was unlike any journey they had taken. The space here felt viscous. It clung to the hull not with gravity, but with a kind of psychic drag, a universal weariness that sought to pull all things into stillness and decay. Alara felt it most keenly. Navigating here wasn't like following the currents of space-time. It was like wading through a swamp of apathy. Every light year eroded their will, making memories of hope and purpose feel distant, replaced by a whispering, persistent question, why bother? Something is draining us, as she managed, sweat beading on her forehead. It's not attacking our minds. It's emptying them. They saw it in the first system within the veil, a world that looked Earth-like, with blue oceans and green continents. Its cities were intact, their lights still glittering across the night side. There were no signs of war or disaster, but as the lament drew closer, its unique senses perceived the truth. Nothing, Kalen's voice intoned, carrying a cold confusion. We feel nothing. No joy. No sorrow, no love, no hate. 7 billion sentient beings. And all we sense is stillness. This was the weapon of their new enemy, an entity the lament came to call the languor. It did not consume matter or energy. It consumed meaning. It didn't destroy civilizations. It drained them of their purpose, leaving behind hollow shells, people and societies that still functioned by rote but without any spark of will, creativity, or emotion. They were ghosts in their own machines, living in a hell of pointlessness. How do we fight that? Marcus snarled, his impotence clenching his fists. Our weapons are memory, emotion. To use them against this thing would be to serve it a feast. Thorn stood silent, his granite face in deep thought. For the first time, he recognized the limit of his strategy. He had prepared for a war assault, but this was an existential crisis. If it feeds on meaning, he said slowly. Then we must give it something it cannot digest. In the heart of the ship, in the nexus of 7 million souls, Kalen and the memory of Viridia searched for an answer. Their rage was useless. Their pain was a delicacy. Their hope was a fine wine. But deep within those memories, beneath the grand emotions that shaped history, were smaller, more stubborn things. The ship changed its projection. It did not broadcast a wave of emotion. Instead, it sent something far more subtle. It projected the memory of a baker on Viridia, who woke at dawn every day not for profit, but for the simple feeling of flour on his hands and the smell of fresh bread. It projected the stubbornness of a mathematician who spent 20 years solving a single theorem, not for fame, but for the pure, clean beauty of the solution. It projected the patience of a parent teaching a child to tie their shoes, repeating the simple act hundreds of times for no reward but the act itself. It projected the small, meaningless, obstinate acts of existence, the things done not for a grand purpose but simply for their own sake. It had weaponized the mundane. It had turned routine into an act of defiance. A ripple went through the planet below. The languor, feasting on the apathy of 7 billion souls, encountered something it could not comprehend: creativity without a goal, effort without a reward, existence for existence' sake. It was like feeding sand to a creature that consumed only sugar. It was not toxic, but it was without nourishment and utterly indigestible. The entity flinched. For the first time in millennia, it felt a sensation akin to discomfort. The psychic shroud it held over the planet began to thin. On the surface, someone, for perhaps the first time in generations, looked up at the sky and truly saw the stars. A question formed in their mind. Isn't that beautiful? The languor retreated, not wounded, but confused. It slunk back into the darkness of the nebula, leaving the crew of the Echoes lament in the silence. They had not won. They had merely pushed back the darkness for a moment. "It will be back," Jian said, her voice trembling but firm. "And we will be here," Thorn replied, a new light in his eyes. They understood their new mission. They were not a sword of vengeance or a shield of defense. They were a lighthouse. Their task was to journey into the galaxy's darkest places, not to fight the monsters, but to remind people how to light their own candles. They were the Echoes' lament, and they carried not just the memory of a world that was lost. They carried the memory of why any world was worth fighting for in the first place. Their journey had only just begun.